How's everybody doing on this fine, cold fall Kentucky day? I think it's a windy, 40 degrees outside, but wait around, it'll be 80 degrees on Monday, so don't worry about it. I call this meeting the Education Assessment and Accountability Review Subcommittee to order on this Tuesday, October 18th at 3 o'clock in Annex Room 131. If I can remind everybody, please turn your phones on silent. All materials have been sent electronically via email and should also be available on the committee's LRC website. At this time, will the clerk please call the roll?
Senator Kerr, Senator Neal, Senator Wilson, Representative Bojanowski, Representative Huff, Representative Riley,
Here.
Co-Chair Wise, Chair Reed.
Here. Okay, at this time, we do not have a quorum, so we will move past the approval of the June 7th, 2022 minutes. But at this time, for the business of the day, we already have at the table a fine group of individuals that works hard for the LOC and the Office of Education and Accountability. If y'all would please introduce yourselves for the record.
Bartlett Worry, Office of Education Accountability.
Allison Stevens, Office of Education Accountability.
Sabrina Cummins.
All right, thank you all for coming today. And the Office of Education Accountability is here to present a review of school funding adequacy studies. So at this time, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Good afternoon. In November of 2021, EARS assigned OEA a study to review the most recent adequacy studies measuring the cost of an adequate public education. This presentation will show the results of the adequacy reports completed in Kentucky and comparable states. In addition, we will discuss limitations to the two most used types of adequacy studies and conclude with alternate options of reviewing state funding formulas. We will now review the major conclusions of the report. Kentucky's current definition of an adequate education makes it difficult to measure the outcomes to determine a required cost. Adequacy studies have strengths and weaknesses in each of their methodologies. This report reviewed 9 adequacy studies, and none were found to be adequately funding all districts. Adequacy studies that base recommendations on prototypical schools and districts may overestimate or underestimate resources or require major changes in administrative staff. Adequacy studies use language that implies districts can meet educational goals by following their recommendations, but fall short on guaranteeing results. Adequacy models are state-specific and may not be translatable to another state because of different policy preferences, realities, and needs to reach adequacy. Adequacy models may rely on insufficient research or unsupported assumptions. In 2014, Pikus Audit and Associates performed an evidence-based evaluation of Kentucky school funding. This model estimated an additional $2.44 billion was needed in state and local funds to reach adequacy. The evidence model excluded federal funds from its calculations. If federal funds were added, an additional $1.88 billion in funding would be needed instead of the $2.44. In Kentucky, only one small, wealthy, independent district was spending above adequacy levels. However, when we added in federal funds, another district also was spending above the recommended level. Kentucky received a D for funding level and funding distribution, and a C for funding effort based on the Education Law Center's methodology. According to the report, The Adequacy and Fairness of State School Finance, Kentucky compares favorably to the national average based on fiscal effort. However, an extra $4,000 per pupil would be required to adequately fund education in the highest poverty districts. Kentucky uses a student-based funding formula, which is recommended by EdBuild. However, Kentucky falls short and how we currently fund add-ons for student and district unique characteristics. Kentucky is demographically similar to West Virginia. However, Kentucky performs better on NAEP, and we also spend less per pupil than West Virginia. Kentucky is spending less than the nation on K-12 education and has lower starting teacher salaries. However, after we adjust for personal income, Kentucky is actually spending more than the national average, and we also have higher starting teacher salaries than the national average. This slide includes the data used in conducting this report. OEA staff reviewed several adequacy reports along with data from several other well-known institutions. Our presentation will begin with how adequacy is defined in Kentucky, followed by the results of prior adequacy reports completed in Kentucky and comparable states. We will then show what research has said about strengths and limitations to the different types of adequacy studies and show a couple examples of other adequacy outcomes. Next, we will review some issues that OEA has with the 2014 Kentucky Adequacy Report, and we'll end the presentation with a brief discussion on how a few states changed their funding formula without doing an adequacy study. And finally, we will recap our major conclusions. The 1989 Kentucky Supreme Court stated that more money would be needed to provide an adequate education. However, they did not recommend how much funding was needed. This new system should ensure that students become sufficient in the following 7 capacities. Here are the first 4. And here are the final 3. Based on this definition, it would be hard to perform an adequacy study to determine how much money would be needed for all students to reach proficiency in these 7 capacities. And it would be hard to determine outcomes based on these capacities. The next couple of slides will discuss the outcomes of adequacy studies performed in Kentucky and comparable states. While there are 4 major types of adequacy studies, as you will see on the next slide, the professional judgment and evidence-based studies are most widely used. OEA reviewed 9 adequacy studies in Kentucky and comparable states. 3 were professional judgment studies, 5 were evidence-based, and 1 was a hybrid. As shown on this slide, each study found that additional funding would be needed for states to reach adequacy. In 2003, the evidence-based model needed an additional $740 million to become adequate. 11 years later, the 2014 evidence-based report increased the adequacy cost by 3 times the amount from 2003. As you can see, all these studies resulted in increased funding needed for any state to reach adequacy. The next couple of slides will discuss what other researchers have to say about the strengths and weaknesses of the professional judgment and the evidence-based models. The full report does go into detail the other 2 adequacy models. The professional judgment approach relies on teams of teachers and other education professionals who identify the number of staff and operating expenses needed at the district and school level to meet state standards. These experts also identify the additional resources needed to educate students with special needs, such as special education students and students who are at risk of failing. Advantages to the professional judgment approach include it is easy to understand and articulate. In addition, the cost is estimated by panels of educational professionals. And finally, the panelists take into consideration how much is needed to fund special needs of students. According to other researchers, disadvantages to the professional judgment approach are the costs are not linked to specific outcomes, and often this method produces unrestrained, wishful recommendations without considering practical constraints such as the amount of funding actual available or prioritizing trade-offs, and assumes the recommended resources and funding levels will produce desired outcomes without testing these assumptions. In addition, the report relies on too much subjectivity and are not research-based methods. The evidence-based model, also called the state-of-the-art approach, predicts that this model enables districts to double student performance over a 4 to 6 year time frame. The model identifies a set of school-level resources required to deliver a comprehensive and high-quality instructional program based on empirical research. These school-level resources come from multiple reform strategies rather than a single reform model. The reform strategies include implementing appropriate student-to-educator ratios and staffing interventions for students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, special education, and English as second language students. In addition, conversations are held with educational experts. According to other researchers, the disadvantage to this model is that the model is updated regularly, which will make prior evidence-based studies outdated, and models created for one state may not be applicable or desirable in another state. And while these research methods work in one district to improve student performance, they may not work in another district. In addition, basing recommendations on prototypical districts may overestimate or underestimate resources when districts vary from the prototypes or may require major reorganization of existing school systems. And finally, evidence-based models do not guarantee their recommendations will produce desired results. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to Allison to discuss a couple of other known adequacy reports that are produced by other entities.
Thank you, Sabrina. We will now review adequacy outcomes from school funding fairness measures and other states' adequacy studies. The Education Law Center grades states on 3 measures of school funding fairness relative to other states. Grades are assigned using a typical curve. Funding level is the state and local revenue per pupil. Kentucky ranked below average with nearly $13,500 per pupil, compared to the national average of nearly $15,500 per pupil, and ranked number 36 in the nation. Funding distribution is whether districts with high poverty receive additional funds. Kentucky ranked 33 and was considered regressive because high poverty districts received less than low poverty districts. Funding effort is the percentage of a state's economic activity spent on education. Kentucky ranked 19 in the nation with 3.6% of GDP compared to the national average of 3.4%. The report, The Adequacy and Fairness of State School Finance, also compares states on 3 measures of school funding fairness relative to other states. Measures vary slightly from the previous report because of data variations. Fiscal effort is how much of a state's total resources or capacity are spent directly on education, calculated by dividing total education expenditures by GDP. Kentucky ranked 22nd, with 3.6% of GDP spent on education, compared to the national average of 3.5%. Kentucky's funding adequacy, or whether spending is enough to achieve education goals, was below adequate and would require around $4,000 more per student. Kentucky ranked number 30, and 37 other states were also found to be below adequate. Lastly, progressivity is whether more resources are allocated to districts serving larger portions of disadvantaged children. Kentucky ranked number 28 and was found to be flat, meaning that high poverty and low poverty districts received similar amounts. 3 other states were considered flat, 24 states were considered progressive, and 20 states were considered regressive. We'd like to take a look at Wyoming. a state that has used adequacy studies to shape education funding since 2005. Wyoming's legislature contracted with Picus, Auden, and Associates to recalibrate the state's education funding model every 5 years since 2005, with additional studies reviewing school funding elements in 2004, 2008, and 2009. Between 2006, the first year after the first adequacy study, and 2019, per-student revenue increased by $6,000. However, Wyoming has not met its accountability goals, and several measures of student performance have actually declined. It is important to note that Wyoming's legislature incorporated or adapted some of the adequacy study's recommendations and did not implement others. Let's look at similar states' per-pupil spending and test scores. Tennessee spends about $1,500 per pupil less than Kentucky, but performs about the same on NAEP. On the other hand, Kentucky spends about $2,400 per pupil more than Kentucky and performs better on NAEP. Kentucky spent $1,000 per pupil less than West Virginia and dedicates more of its total state budget to elementary and secondary education, but performed better on NAEP. This shows that the relationship between spending and test scores is not straightforward. We will now review the most recent adequacy study performed in Kentucky and concerns identified by OEA. Kentucky adequacy studies, including the 2014 model, have common elements, as shown on this slide. There are 3 categories: personnel resources, such as teachers, principals, and superintendents; dollar per pupil resources, such as instructional materials, technology, and textbooks; and costs that are carried forward that were not evaluated, such as transportation. This slide shows the concerns identified by OEA. We will begin with the first 2. The 2014 Kentucky model provides funding based on resources needed and requires funds to be spent on particular resources. Kentucky uses a guaranteed base per pupil amount adjusted by special student add-ons and a formula for transportation. These funds are not required to be spent on particular children or identified needs. To implement recommendations, Kentucky would have to drastically change its school funding methodology. This also means that recommendations cannot be compared to current costs in Kentucky. Based on these concerns, there are several elements of the model that would be difficult to apply in Kentucky, including student counts, teachers, special student populations, nurses, instructional aides, and supervisory aides. To demonstrate, we will review student counts and at-risk students. First, student counts. The evidence-based model calculated base aid on average daily membership, while Kentucky bases aid on prior year adjusted average daily attendance plus growth. In addition, the model recommends basing districts and schools on student count rather than on geography, such as creating districts of 3,900 students, and does not match the practical realities of providing education in Kentucky based on the size of existing schools and districts. Applying the model may either overestimate or underestimate resources or require major organization. For example, I apologize. It's showing up on the preview, but
I don't know why it's not showing up here. Sorry. Can you go back one more, maybe? Just go back. There we go.
we don't know what happened. Sorry.
That was weird.
For example, Wolfe County currently has 3 elementary schools, which also serve 6th grade, 1 middle school, and 1 high school. The model recommends 450 students per elementary school, 450 students per middle school, and 600 students per high school. If applied to Wolfe County, this would produce 1 elementary school, 0.6 middle schools and 0.6 high schools. At the district level, this model bases district size on 3,900 students per district. Under this model, the largest district would be divided into 22.3 districts, and the smallest would only make up 0.045 of a district. This would affect all central office, maintenance, and operations staff, such as the number of superintendents needed. This shows how the model does not fit districts and schools in Kentucky and may result in overestimating or underestimating resources in districts and schools as they currently exist. On the other hand, applying the model would drastically change how education is provided, from personnel to school buildings. At-risk students are another example. The model separates fundings for tutors, substitutes, professional development days, and funding for instructional materials to support at-risk students in particular, totaling nearly $916.7 million in school year 2013. Kentucky funds at-risk students through an add-on weight of 0.15 to the guaranteed base per pupil funding amount of $4,000. In school year 2022, this amounted to $600 per at-risk student and totaled $223.5 million. These funds are not required to be spent on at-risk students in particular. This model represents a totally different way of funding education. It would not be possible to increase total SEEK output by the amount recommended by the model and guarantee benefiting particular groups of students or provide particular resources with the increased funding. The last concern is that some elements lack supporting evidence. This slide shows elements that aren't supported by evidence. For some of these elements, the authors state there's no research connecting the element to student achievement, such as librarians. For others, the element is related to the functioning of the school or district with no evidence supporting the number recommended, such as principals or superintendents and other central office staff. We will review substitutes and the gifted and talented program to demonstrate. The 2014 Kentucky model recommended funding 10 days of substitute teacher coverage for every teacher to allow for 1 or 2 sick days, absences for other reasons, or long-term medical leave. This recommendation is not based on actual teacher absences and does not match the need for substitutes in Kentucky. The 2014 model allocated $152.8 million for substitutes. In comparison, Kentucky only spent $40.7 million on substitutes in school year 2021. The Gifted and Talented program is another example. The model recommends $25 per total pupil to support the Gifted and Talented program. However, the authors note there's no evidence that gifted and talented programs affect academic outcomes, and such programs are offered to students already performing above state standards. There are several additional concerns with the 2014 Kentucky evidence-based model. The model does not guarantee results or set a time frame for achieving results. Recommendations may not fit Kentucky policy preferences. For example, the most recent evidence-based model by the same authors recommends against hiring school resource officers, while KRS 158.4414 requires districts to assign 1 or more certified SROs to each school. Lastly, this model carries forward many costs, assuming them to be adequate without evaluating if that is accurate, including transportation, which is not currently funded at 100%. I will now turn it over to Sabrina, who will discuss alternatives to adequacy studies.
Thank you, Allison. A few states have recently revamped or made changes to how their funding formula was updated. While the full report goes into details on the changes made to their funding formula, the following slides will discuss the process for how the formula changed. Since 1992, Tennessee has used a resource-based allocation system for their funding model. This year, the governor of Tennessee proposed a new funding formula that was developed from 18 funding subcommittees that included several members with different expertise. The new model of funding is a student-based foundation, which is also how Kentucky funds SEEK. After the subcommittees met and came up with their recommendations, a steering committee of state officials discussed the recommendations and provided feedback and guidance to the department. Then the governor proposed the new funding formula, followed with their General Assembly approving the new formula to start in the 23-24 school year. In 2018, the Vermont General Assembly passed Act and Resolves number 173, which commissioned a study to examine the pupil weights utilized in their school funding formula. This study was to examine if the current weights were adequate and equitable. In 2021, the General Assembly established the Task Force on Implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors Report to determine if and how to implement the recommendations. This task force was made up of 4 senators and representatives. They met 12 times in a little over 5 months. And in May of this year, Senate Bill 287 was passed and signed by the governor. Nevada changed the way they fund at-risk students starting this year. This new funding formula, commissioned in 2019 by the 11-member Commission on School Funding Committee, allowed the State Board of Education the authority to re-examine the definition and funding for at-risk students. Infinite Campus, the same company that Kentucky uses for its student information system, created the new at-risk calculation. The old at-risk funding formula was based on students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. The new definition of at-risk students was to include a broader set of social and academic factors that hamper student progress. A recent article published in Educate Nevada criticizes this new funding model because they estimate that only about 67,000 students would now qualify for at-risk funding compared to 271,000 that qualified under the old model. The next few slides will detail how EdBuild, a former organization whose mission was to work with states to redesign their funding formulas, developed descriptions for model policies for student and districts add-ons to the base funding formula. Kentucky uses a student-centered funding formula, which EdBuild recommends. While they do not suggest how much the base funding amount should be set at, they do recommend 3 tiers of model policies on how to fund add-ons to the base funding for students and district characteristics. According to EdBuild, Silver is somewhat less ambition, but would still advance policy in most states. Gold includes a more ambitious and uncommon policy. While the Moonshot tier increases equity and precision and are far more complex, EdBuild recommends considering only 1 or 2 of these funding policies instead of having all Moonshot policies. The following 3 slides will show you an example of how these 3 different tiers would work if you were funding students who are at risk. When looking at economic disadvantaged students, the Silver policy should be a generous weight and student count should be directly certified. In addition, it should include categories of homeless, foster, and refugee students. Kentucky currently does the direct certification. However, we do not include homeless, foster, and refugee students in the at-risk funding formula. The Gold policy is based on the concentration of free and reduced price lunch students, or should use 2 weights, one based on the number of disadvantaged students, and would also include the percent of disadvantaged students. Here's the example for the Moonshot policy. The weight would be at least double the amount of funding for regular education students and use an additional classification such as linking student address records with household income captured on tax returns. The report also discusses different model policies for English language learners, special education, grade level, gifted and talented, sparsity and isolation, and within state cost differences. We will now revisit our major conclusions. As we have stated, adequacy studies are not state-specific and cannot be used in other states. No adequacy study performed was ever adequately funded and resulted in more funding needed. Use of prototypical school and districts can cause serious overage and underage. Resource-based adequacy studies do not explain how extra funding would apply to a student-based foundation, such as Kentucky's SEEK funding model. In addition, these studies do not guarantee students reach proficiency. And spending more does not guarantee improved student outcomes. And finally, there are alternatives to updating funding formulas without doing an adequacy study. This concludes the presentation, and we would be happy to answer any questions from the members at this time.
Thank you all so much. We truly appreciate y'all's expertise, and I know this was one of those reports that you had to dive into for a while, and as always, it helps us as legislators to get different perspectives as we make policy, and we truly appreciate y'all's effort and truly appreciate y'all's professionalism. Thank you all. So round of applause for them. They work hard, guys, so thank you all. We don't have a quorum, so we can't vote on the report today, so we'll hold that over to the November 1st meeting, but we do have some questions, if that's okay with you all. Ms. Representative Bojanowski, you have the floor.
All right, thank you.
Unless you got more than 10, just kind of roll with them.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you. No, I won't have more than 10. So I did read a good part of the report. And did you have a recommendation of what you think the state should do, or was it more of just a report on adequacy studies?
We did not have any recommendations
Okay.
at this time.
Okay, so as I read through, a lot of the adequacy studies seem to focus on the return on investment based on test scores. And I pulled out a copy of the capacities, and we do actually have 8 now. There are so many aspects of our capacities that are not measured by test scores. And so to try to figure out if we're providing an adequate education based on our capacities, definitely would be a challenge. I understand that. So, kind of thinking about the Picus-Odin study and perhaps $1.88 billion to bring all districts to a level of adequacy, although we're not exactly sure how to measure adequacy. My suggestion to the committee is to simply go ahead and fund all-day kindergarten, 100% of transportation costs. Under that $1.88 billion, we could probably add in universal pre-K, and while we're at it, maybe switch us over to average daily membership. So, we've been doing a lot of talking about education finance, and that's kind of where my gut is as far as just making a recommendation. So that's the world according to Rep. Bojanowski. But I did kind of go back to my Bruce Baker book and did some thinking about, because I assumed you would say, no, you weren't making recommendations. And what recommendations does he make? And he does have a framework he describes in the last chapter of his book. And number 1 is to estimate the costs of providing equal education opportunity. And I think that would be a very important strategy for us, because if we don't know how much it will cost, then it's just let's throw money in the air and see what sticks. And statements like perhaps money doesn't make a difference will come up. His second framework element is design equitable and adequate financing systems around empirically based targets of costs and needs of providing equal educational opportunities. And then thirdly, to finance that system. So, the scholars do know kind of what direction we can go in kind of solving the issue of what is adequacy and how much will it cost to get to adequacy. And I just encourage my colleagues, I'll definitely lend you the book if you'd like, to take in some consideration of his recommendations. Thank you.
Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, was any funding for teacher pensions included in this at all?
Yes, they were.
Okay. And what about the other states? Do they include that as well in their adequacy studies?
As far as the ones that Picus and Auden did, they did, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, guys. I think with Ms. Representative Bojanowski's and Senator Wilson's, I think that was about 10. We got close. So thank you all so much again. We'll bring up the report again on the November 1st meeting. Okay, thank you all so much. Each year, the subcommittee performs its oversight function by approving the research agenda for the next year. And so if any member of the committee has any suggestions, please get that in to Lauren Bush or Senator Wise or myself before the end of the business day, and then we will vote on those new research probabilities on the November 1st meeting. We will bring this report that we just heard back up as well. So with that, the chair will entertain a motion for adjournment. So moved and second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed, the meeting is adjourned. We will meet again November 1st. Thank you all.